Greetings, everyone, and welcome to America in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today is Casey Harper, our Washington, D.C. bureau chief. Casey, there's a looming deadline for Congress to raise the debt limit, or the U.S. will default on its loans. U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, a Republican from California, this week introduced a plan to cut federal spending when Congress does agree to raise the debt ceiling. Tell us about his plan.
Yeah, high school seniors with English papers and members of Congress have something in common, and that is they like to procrastinate. So we are coming down to the wire. That was a great joke, Dan. I really worked on that, crafted that late last night.
I'm having to hold in my laughter here, yeah.
Yeah, I know. Right. You've gotten really good at holding in your laughter. My joke, I guess a lot of practice. So Congress has been given this deadline by the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen a while back, actually. And she said, hey, and this happens at a pretty regular interval now because the Congress doesn't pass budgets anymore, which is a huge dysfunctional problem. And basically what Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary for Biden, says, we're coming up on this deadline. She doesn't give an exact day, but it was kind of like a spring situation where if we don't raise the debt limit, then we are going to default on our debt. So we owe people around the world money as the federal government, and we have a perfect credit score is the way to think about it, a bond rating. But if we don't rate, but there's also a limit legally on the amount of money that the U.S. can borrow. And so if we don't raise our debt limit, then we're not going to be able to borrow more money and pay our debtors, which is kind of funny. That's how bad our debt is, that we can't keep going unless we just keep raising the debt limit like every year or two. So if we don't do this, we're going to default on our debt obligations, which would cause possibly, a recession if we're not in one already. It would hurt our credit score, be very bad for our credit score. It would be very bad for the global economy because the global economy is so based on the U.S. dollar and the U.S. economy, at least for now, although a lot of nations overseas are moving away from the U.S. dollar, which is its own catastrophe economically for the U.S. So, we have a lot of landmines we're dancing around with our economy, our debt, and all the inflation and things right now. But this is one we cannot step on in the eyes of most experts. And so we've got this deadline coming up. Biden has said, hey, this is too important. I'm not going to negotiate on it because, we can't play chicken or something with the credit score of the United States. Now, Republicans have said, hey, you can't just say I'm not negotiating. That's not leadership. And what's really important is our debt and cutting spending. And so Republicans this week under House Speaker Kevin McCarthy's leadership introduced this bill. It's called the Limit, Save, Grow Act. It's over 300 pages. It lifts the debt limit by $1.5 trillion, which would get us through March of 2024, which is important. We can talk about it. That's important. It is the election year. It'll put Biden's feet to the fire. It could give Republicans leverage to really extort Biden in an election year, which is an interesting political side note. And it cuts spending. McCarthy says it cuts spending by about $4.5 trillion, which is pretty significant spending cuts. He doesn't want to touch Medicaid, Social Security. It doesn't really solve all the problems of the U.S. debt, but it is a pretty significant cut. So the question is Biden actually going to negotiate? Can this get some traction in the Senate? But what really changed this week is the ball is really in Democrats' court now, maybe in the Senate's court, but definitely in Biden's court. And House Republicans have put the onus on them, say, hey, the deadline is here. We put our plan out. It's in writing. We voted on it. Your move, Biden. That's basically where we are now.
Of course, U.S. debt is already at about $31.5 trillion, approaching $32 trillion. We have a massive budget deficit. If you or I amass such debt, we'd have to declare bankruptcy. It seems like the logical answer to our current situation is cutting spending.
Well, the word you use that's problematic is logical. So you have a false assumption that DC is operating based on logic and what's best for the country and reason and that kind of stuff. And when sadly it's more operated based on political wins and who's looking good in the news cycle today. So I think everyone would probably agree that they want to cut spending and that it's needed, but it goes back to the procrastination thing. It's like, you have to do your taxes, and everyone in your family knows that you have to do your taxes. But until April 15th or this year, April 18th, there's millions of people who just won't do their taxes until the last day because they need that hard deadline of that threat of basically jail or fine from the federal government to do their taxes. The problem is Congress can always just file for an extension, which is basically what they're doing. That's what doing these resolutions are. They don't pass budgets. They don't cut spending. They can just kick it down the road. So there's kind of bad incentives now where nobody wants to be the lawmaker calling for cutting spending when everyone else is saying voting for raises. This is kind of the problem with democracy that a lot of, philosophers in Western tradition wrote about, and that even the founders were concerned about, that once the voters realize they can just vote themselves a raise, democracies can crumble. And that's actually why we were more modeled like a republic and senators were appointed, not elected, because of the fear that mobs and total democratic rule would lead to financial ruin. It was actually expressly warned about and acknowledged as a concern by the founders, and we're living it out now. So yeah, it's not great. And it's not just the Democrats either. Republicans are very guilty of this. People will say they want to cut spending, but nobody can agree what it is. And they all have their one thing they won't cut. So there's a lot of Republicans who will never cut defense spending. There's a lot of Democrats who will only want to cut defense spending. And so they're all kind of hypocritical in their own ways. And our grandchildren will probably pay the price.
Thank you for your insight, Casey, but we are out of time. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Casey Harper, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.